My name's Conrad Hughes. I'm very happy to be engaging with you on this topic, education in an age of disruption. What are the lessons that we've learned from this experience of the COVID-19 lockdown? And what sort of vision for the future of education do we want? First of all, what do we mean by disruption? Well, throughout the history of humankind, we have seen major social disruptions changing the way we think about ourselves and therefore the way we think about education. Take the Black Death. Millions of people across Europe dying from the plague. This transformed society in fundamental ways and led to the Renaissance. And with the Renaissance came not only political changes and economic changes, but a different way of looking at the world. The printing press and the levels of literacy that brought about, household literacy, absolutely changed the relationship with knowledge. Knowledge was no longer something that was canonical and hidden from the masses. It was something that could be accessed by everybody. Take the earthquake of 1755 in Lisbon. This event, which killed thousands of people, was a huge trauma for Europe and created philosophical discussion among Enlightenment thinkers that paved a way to considerations about our relationship with the cosmos and with God. Notions of a theodicy, where reality needs to be looked at from the largest possible perspective, came into being, and it very much paved the way for a lot of the romantic notions that we see in education throughout the 19th century. That civilization is bad and that the intrinsic nature of human beings is good. This was the thesis of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, for example, who said of the Lisbon earthquake that it wasn't the natural force that killed human beings, but all of the human-made constructs, houses, churches, buildings that toppled on people. So we see a transformation in the way that we see ourselves and what an education is for, once again caused by disruption. Principles of romantic education remain with us today. Take the Second World War, this massive disruption, which was of fundamental importance to the entire planet, left us with the philosophy of modern existentialism, a belief that human beings aren't actually rational creatures and that what drives us is raw emotion and questions about forging meaning in a meaningless world. And this, of course, has influenced education. The idea of free choice, the idea of students choosing where they might want to go to university, what they might wish to study. So a lot of the assumptions that we make about education are rooted in historical change, and that historical change tends to be driven by disruption. Now 2020, there is no doubt about this, 2020 is a massive paradigm shift. 2020 is a fulcrum. It's a lever that is changing the world. The world after 2020 will not be what it was before. It's a threshold. Now, there have been a number of important dates in modern history, and I'm talking about the last 30, 40 years. 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, that had fundamental implications for political and economic life. The invention of the World Wide Web, the massification of university course offerings through MOOCs, all of these innovations in the 90s and early 2000s also brought about important social change and implications for education. The 2008 crash, massively important for the way that we look at the political and economic system of globalization. But none of these, I believe, were as strong in terms of a paradigm-shifting event as 2020. Why? Well, because of COVID, because of the lockdown that this has caused, what it's done to the tissue of human society, and what it's done to education. Let's start with the lockdown. Now, research tells us that at least 1.2 billion children have been out of school over the period of the last months because of COVID-19 lockdown. Right now, there are over 500 million children who are not attending school because of COVID. And that's over and above demographic issues we have with the access to education across the world. The disruption has been huge. Now, I've written about this in an article that came out with UNESCO some time ago to talk about the impact of school closures. And what we've seen, in a word, is the following: widening gaps. Gaps between human beings have been widened because of the COVID-19 lockdown. First of all, let's talk about educational gaps between students within school systems, between schools within common systems, and across systems in different countries. Forecasts done by organizations such as the Brookings Institute show that loss in learning has been to the magnitude of about 1 year if we count the lockdown from round about March, when it took place, for example, in northwestern Europe, to the present. In other words, on average, children being out of school has meant that where they could have capitalized on natural increments in education and learning that happen when you're at school have not happened. And this graph, for example, shows how there's a difference between students who were part in school, who weren't in school altogether, but everybody lost out. Now, what's been particularly problematic, and we all know this as teachers, has been the effects of the lockdown on students with learning needs, students who might struggle to access the curriculum. Because when you put learning online, or when you create gaps in learning, it's the stronger students who survive, not the students who are struggling. So it's widened the attainment gap. And that year's deficit will carry on as a knowledge deficit through time. It'll be more and more difficult for the students who have that gap in their learning to catch up, especially if the lockdown continues. So that's an important deficit in learning that's been created. There's what we call the digital divide. This is another type of gap widener. It means that some countries, some districts, some organizations, some systems have better access to technology than others. And we've known this for a while, but it became dramatically important when schools started to go online because of the lockdown. Some schools were able to provide world-class, synchronous online learning. Other schools provided asynchronous online learning, meaning that work was posted intermittently, but the curriculum diagram or the timetable wasn't followed at the same frequency as it would be under normal circumstances. Other schools had to settle for texts, WhatsApp, using whatever was available to keep the lifeline of learning happening. And of course, there were schools, countries, areas, regions where connectivity was not strong enough or available enough, sufficiently available for learning to continue at all. So learning stopped. And this map shows that there's a reinforcement of the geopolitical, socio-economic differences between countries in the digital divide. The countries that tend to fare well in PISA scores, that come out well on attainment scores, have strong economies and taxation systems are the ones that have broadband access and were able to weather the storm. Whereas countries with broken tax systems that are facing financial deficits, countries that are in less developed regions fell even further behind. So access to technology, a lack of access to technology, has widened this gap. What's at work here is called the Matthew effect. Now, the Matthew effect is this syndrome, it's this phenomenon where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. In other words, if you take two students and they enter an environment and one has already consolidated quite a lot of knowledge and the other has patchy knowledge, what happens is the student with strong knowledge can capitalize even more because of that strong knowledge and go even further and strip ahead. Whereas a student with gaps in knowledge, with fragmented knowledge, cannot assimilate and accommodate new information and actually falls further behind. So that widening gap, called the Matthew effect, has been a dramatic consequence of COVID. And the effects of that are going to be felt over time in all sorts of ways. Assessment imploded during the COVID-19 lockdown and continues to implode. Terminal examinations were cancelled in the UK, in Switzerland. International examination boards such as the International Baccalaureate, they cancelled end-of-year exams in the Northern Hemisphere. I've written about this in an article published by the World Economic Forum. What did it show us? What did it tell us? Well, some districts and countries opted for predicted grades by teachers as a proxy for those exams that weren't taken. Others used algorithms, mathematical equations, to try and discern or predict what a student would have got. And when the results came out, there were problems. Students hadn't taken their exams and grades were calculated in different ways across different systems. What is this telling us about the examination system that we have in place at present? If when it's cancelled, we don't really have a strong plan B. The effects of this will be major going forward because they have a knock-on effect not only on students, but on universities, and down the line, eventually, employment. So this is a worry. 2020, not just because of COVID, because we could talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, political events that are taking place in the United States, and a number of other important socio-political developments. But especially because of COVID-19, is changing the world. And educators are feeling that change just as much as everybody else, and in some ways even more. Finally, there's this deep question. What sort of future are we preparing students for? Is it the future of the present? That is to say, a world with largely deficient moral leadership in many countries, an economically unsustainable situation where the 8 richest men have the wealth of the poorest half of the planet, where neoliberal policies have allowed monopolies to become so powerful that they're completely out of control, where we are destroying the planet in the way that we behave, what we eat. Is that the future we want? Clearly not. How are we going to use this wonderful experience that we have called education to create a better world? That's where we must be teaching not just knowledge, not just skills, but attitudes, dispositions, ethics. And we shouldn't just be teaching ethics and social responsibility as big ideas that exist by themselves. They have to be understood in a context. So at my school, we have our own program called the Universal Learning Program, which is based on competences that are necessary for the future. Lifelong learning, self-agency, how to interact with other people, how to interact with the world, how to interact with diverse tools and resources, transdisciplinary thinking, and multiliterateness. And all of these we sum up in 4 major statements. Character, who am I? Passion, what is my purpose? Mastery, how can I go further? And collaboration, how can we work together? We break these competences down into assessed micro-competences, as we call them. Things like balancing rights with responsibilities, accountability, fellowship, critical thinking. And all of these are interwoven into our curriculum design so that the message we're sending out to students is that knowledge alone is not what matters. Knowledge and skills alone aren't enough. It's knowledge plus skill plus attitude. In other words, competences. So working on attitudes and understanding the world around us and the impact we have on the world is vital. And I hope that that's what you're doing in your school. We are preparing students to leave with a passport, which through the Mastery Consortium, the mastery.org transcript, will show their competences to universities and to industry. What kind of a lifelong learner am I? What is my quantum of self-agency? How good am I at interacting with other people? All of these important life skills that are also about attitude and about disposition. This is revolutionizing the way that we look at a high school graduating student's school leaving certificate. This is not just an academic transcript, it's about much more. And we want to capture learning wherever it happens. That's part of preparing students for a post-COVID world, where they are going to be called upon to do all sorts of things that we're not even aware of yet. And they're just simply not reflected well enough in a standard academic curriculum. Our home is the world. We have to love it, and we have to make sure that we're doing everything we can to protect it. Thank you.